tell you what, when these guys meet, they never disappoint. So Alireza Firouzja playing with white here. We've got Magnus Carlsen with black, who had just lost his previous round to Fabi, got smashed up in quick time. So Magnus tries to play solid. Alireza goes e4, we get e5 in response, no Sicilians. Now we get knight f3, the Italian game, bishop c4 on the board, and Magnus plays some very standard opening moves, so does Alireza, but here Alireza goes his own way. So castle's much more common, or knight b to d2, but Alireza goes for bishop g5. And by the way, this is the Grand Chess Tour, rapid play chess, this is round 5. So we get h6 now in response, kicks back the bishop, and we're soon going to see this aggressive pawn g5 push, kicking that bishop back. But first Magnus goes a5. Not the most common pawn structure here. You normally see a6, but okay. Now we get castles, bishop b6, and king h1, not forced, but just comes off this diagonal. Now we get g5. The bishop drops back, and knight h5 from Magnus, showing his aggressive intentions. One day he might move the f-pawn, and sometimes these pawns run as well, as we're going to see in this game. So knight b to d2 from Alireza, standard developing move, and now Magnus here doesn't play the most accurate. So the move I'm drawing is castles, because the computer wants to do that, and if bishop d5 from white, okay, apparently that's the top engine move, well then there's king g7 preparing f5. That's the way the engine wants to go. But Magnus goes bishop to g4, but kind of a strange looking move because that knight's already defended. It provokes h3, Magnus just drops back, so what was that all about? Losing the time. Well, he obviously wanted to provoke this move, and we'll see why soon as he starts running these pawns. Now for Alireza, so he could go pawn d4 here. It's a nice idea, breaking in the centre, and if captures, you recapture with the f-knight and you open the queen on this unprotected piece. The line goes on, but there's a lot of attacking potential. But Alireza goes bishop b5, he just holds off on d4 for the moment, vacates c4 for the knight to hop, and now we see knight f4 from Magnus, preparing his own attacking ideas on the flank. So knight c4 played, hits this bishop, you can't be dropping it back, you know there's a lot of pressure on this pawn and things like that. So h5 from Magnus, gets on with the attack, and Alireza drops back this knight. So first takes, shatters the pawns, then drops back the knight, preempting g4, and if you do it now, well it can be met with pawn h4, so it's not so good for black. So Magnus instead, he plays king to f8, looking to castle by hand, and now pawn d4 from Alireza, cranking open the centre. And you don't want to be capturing with your king where it is, because now there's many good moves for white, but one of them is knight c4. Just opening the knight to attack this pawn, opening the queen, and if you keep munching, well the lines can go like this. You know, these pawns drop off back. Yes, you can win here, stay a pawn ahead, but look at those split rooks, look at the king, look at the problems here, not good for black. So coming back here, we see knight e7 from Magnus, encouraging exchanges, Alireza takes, and now you can play knight f3, good move, but Alireza decides to take first, pawn recaptures, land the knight on f3, and Magnus, he's got a problem with these two pawns, because how do you actually defend both of them? If you take the queens off, for example, rook recaptures and then push f6, well then there's rook d6. You hit both of those weaknesses, they can't both be covered, so it's just no good. So Magnus goes queen c7, wants to keep those ones on, look for chances later on, but Alireza snaps off here, he wins a clean pawn. Magnus challenges the d-file, the queen nudges away, queen b3, also a good move. Now the knight comes to g6, preparing to drop that one back from f4 as we'll see. We get rook a d1, king g7, connects the rooks, and now Alireza spins his knight back to f3, preparing to bring it into the f5 square if he possibly can. So knight e6 from Magnus, knight h4, going into this square, it can't be allowed, so the knight captures, bishop takes back and puts pressure on this rook. f6 chops that attack. Now we get f3 in response, looking to bounce back the bishop. Magnus goes b5, bishop f2, and here we see a mistake from Carlsen. What was his best move? Well, queen c6 is one option. You could chop off a pair of rooks. But after queen c4, which Magnus plays, although you pressure here, can actually be ignored in a really nice line. So you can go bishop to b6. And although you shed this pawn on a2 after you win the file, the trick is this silent and killer move of queen to d3, because you threaten a check down here, which would then win the knight if the queen takes on b2 and leaves the knight's defense. And if you go rook f8, which is one of the top moves, preparing rook f7, well, then you can pick up this b pawn. Now you're still threatening a rook invasion, and you cover this b pawn. There's also threats of bishop a5. Very, very strong continuation. But Alireza, understandably, just kicks back that queen. Magnus drops back, happy to cover the square once again on b6, and Alireza goes bishop e3. A micro improvement of that bishop and preparing f4 in future. So we see rook takes on d1, the rook recaptures, another pair of rooks now come off the board, knight recaptures, and queen d3. Retains control of the d file, and now Alireza wants to get his extra pawns rolling. Well, extra pawn. So knight f7 from Magnus, covers some key dark squares, c4 played, captures, pawn captures, and Alireza gets that great grip over the d5 square. Knight d6 played, hits the c4 pawn, it kicks onto c5, the knight hops back, now king h2, pawn a4 from Magnus, he wants to run down here, try and get a clamp, try and win that one in future. Queen d5, you definitely don't want to trade, connect these pawns for white, and so queen b5 was played, and now bishop f2. It's a really great move from Alireza, because he's getting a bit down on the clock. You know, Magnus about 3.5 minutes up. But here, Magnus burns tons of time, because there's this idea in the air of going queen to e6, followed by bishop h4, threatening some nasty stuff here. So knight h8 starts to play against that. You can then look to spin to g6 and pressure that bishop. So Alireza, he switches plans. He plays pawn f4, we get queen b2 from Magnus, supporting the centre from afar, and bishop g3 intensifies the pressure. So Magnus takes, the bishop recaptures, the knight returns to f7, now that this bishop's no longer coming to this square. We see bishop e3 played, preparing to come to d4, and so knight e5 from Magnus blunts that diagonal, and Alireza now bounces back this way into f4 to pressure this knight. Note that he didn't come to d4 because there's a really nasty tactic. Can you see what black could have played if Alireza had gone bishop d4? So the move is knight f3 check. This pawn is pinned. Suddenly the tables are completely turned. You know, you can take like this, that's game over really. Black's a piece up. So instead, bishop f4, pawn a3 played, and Alireza now just chops off that wonderful centralized knight. You can't recapture with the queen, or after the exchange happens, this endgame's completely lost. Because you've got the 2-on-1 of pawns over here, you can generate a passer that will always distract the black king, and then the white king can march in this way, just a lost pawn endgame. So instead, pawn recaptures, and now the top move for Alireza here was king g3. To bring that one out, start pressuring this pawn, start doing stuff around the king, best way to go. But he starts with queen e6, and now Magnus, quick as a flash, plays pawn h4 and boxes in that white king. And suddenly, Alireza's gone from like +2, +3, big advantage, to the position being equal. But check happens, and Magnus, now it's his turn to go wrong. So there's only one move here to keep an advantage for black. Do pause if you want to have a think about what it might be. It's all related to these kind of pawn end games and not trying to shed pawns, you know, trying to hold on to material. But basically, the move for black here was king to f8. Magnus goes king f7, but now after Alireza takes here, Magnus takes here. Well, here's the problem with having the king on f7 and not on f8. You lose a tempo. After the king moves, you then pick up this pawn. You know, if you could have gained one more tempo, you'd have had time for queen b2 after white went queen h7. But as it was, the pawn dropped off the board, Queen c4 comes behind Alireza's passer. We get Queen b6 check, King g5, and this pawn now marches on. And here, if you carry on running the a pawn, the problem is that you can actually swap these pawns for each other. I won't go through the entire lines, but you can check the king around enough, swap the c for the a pawn, and then you're left with a position where white's got two connected extra passers on the king side. It wins out the game. So instead, Magnus picks up this pawn, but now we get Queen d8 check, King g6, couple more checks here. Why? Well, now the queen sits nicely on f8, covers the f4 square, stops any perpetuals for black. So after c7, Magnus actually resigned the game, because if he carries on pushing his own pawn, this is how the game could end, and this leads to checkmate in just a couple of moves. Black is just way behind in tempos. It's game over. So an awesome game from Alireza. And by the way, this is going to unfortunately be the last game I cover of this tournament, at least, because now for a couple of weeks I'm taking a bit of time off, you know, summer vacation and all that. So I will be back soon with more epic chess. I do hope you enjoyed this one. Hit subscribe to never miss a future. And if you want to see another epic game, check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.